Namaste everyone, I am your co-host Shawnee ma'am. Welcome to your favorite learning channel. The topic for today's video is movement of substances by passive transport. So in our previous video we had studied about plasma membrane, and now we know that plasma membrane is a selectively permeable membrane, which means it allows the movement of certain materials inside and outside the cell, whereas it restricts or prevents the movement of some other materials through it. Okay, so this movement of materials that takes place across the plasma membrane, this can occur by two main types of mechanisms. One is passive transport and the other is active transport. And apart from these two, there are other mechanisms of transport of materials, that is the bulk transport, also the symport, antiport and uniport transport. But today we will be only focusing on the passive transport mechanism. So this passive transport can take place either by osmosis or diffusion or facilitated transport. This facilitated transport is also a type of diffusion. And we will be discussing about active transport mechanism, how it takes place by vesicles and protein pumps, how endocytosis and exocytosis occurs in our next video. Okay, so today we will only be discussing about the passive transport mechanism. Okay, so now let's see what is passive transport. So passive transport is actually a process. It is a process of what? It is a process of movement. It is the movement of substances. Okay. So here movement occurs of substances from one part of the system to another part, and this occurs without the expenditure of what? Without the expenditure of energy or any other special activity. So this process is known as passive transport. Now it usually occurs along the concentration gradient or chemical potential or the electrochemical potential, and that is the reason it doesn't require any expenditure of energy. Now passive transport can take place through two different mechanisms. So if we say passive transport, then we can say that it can take place by two different mechanisms. One is called osmosis and the other one is diffusion. Okay, so these are the two mechanisms by which passive transport can take place. So first we will be studying about osmosis. Okay, so let's see what is osmosis. So it is purely a mechanical diffusion process by which the cells absorb water without spending any amount of energy. Okay, so now let's see how can we define this process of osmosis. It is actually a mechanical process. So we would define osmosis as a process. It is a process by which the water molecules pass from or move from the region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. And this takes place through what? It occurs through a selectively permeable membrane. So this is how we can define the process of osmosis. Okay, so these selectively permeable membranes that we are talking about, through which the water molecules pass, they actually possess aquaporins or channels through which water can diffuse according to its gradient. Okay, so now there are two more terms. One is endosmosis and the other one is exosmosis. So what is endosmosis? Endosmosis. So endosmosis is a process. Okay, so it is also a process by which the water molecules enter into the cell. By which what happens? The water molecules enter. They enter into the cell. Okay, and this process is known as endosmosis. And there is another process called exosmosis. What is exosmosis? It is also a process. And what happens in this process? In this process, the water molecules exit from the cell. They exit from the cell, and this process is known as exosmosis. So in plant cells, due to excess of exosmosis, what happens is that the cytoplasm along with the plasma membrane shrinks away from the cell wall, and this process is known as plasmolysis. Okay, now there are three types of possible solutions in relation to water potential. Okay, so in relation to what? To water potential, there are three types. There are three types of solutions. What are these three types of solutions now? One is the isotonic solution. So what is isotonic solution? Isotonic solution, we can call a solution isotonic when the intracellular and the extracellular fluids have same concentration. They have same concentration. Such a solution is known as isotonic solution. So what happens in case of isotonic solution? So when cells are placed in an isotonic solution, meaning the solution where the intracellular and extracellular fluids have same concentration, then what happens? There is no osmosis, that is, there is no net flow of water that takes place. Hence, there is no change that takes place in the cell. Okay, and that is what happens when the cells are placed in an isotonic solution. That is, there is no osmosis that takes place when cells are placed in isotonic solution, because there is no net movement of water that takes place. Okay, so after isotonic solution, the second type of solution is the hypertonic solution. The hypertonic solution. So what is a hypertonic solution now? So we can call a solution hypertonic solution when the extracellular fluids, have higher concentration. Okay. So in this case, the extracellular fluids have higher concentration of what? Of solutes than what? Than the intracellular fluids, and such solutions are known as hypertonic solution. So now when cells are placed in hypertonic solution, exosmosis occurs. Okay, so we had already talked about exosmosis, that is, in this case, water molecules exit from the cell. So as the water molecules are exiting from the cell when the cells are placed in hypertonic solution, what happens? The cells actually shrink in this case. Okay. Then the third type of solution, is hypotonic. Hypotonic solution. So we can call a solution hypotonic when the extracellular fluids, have what? They have lower concentration. They have lower concentration of what? They have lower concentration of solutes. Than the intracellular fluids. Okay. So such solutions are known as hypotonic solutions, and when the cells are placed in this hypotonic solution, endosmosis take place. That is, water molecules enter into the cell. So now that endosmosis is taking place, that is, water molecules are entering into the cell when they are placed in hypotonic solution, what happens? The cells will swell up. Okay, this is what happens when cells are placed in a hypotonic solution. Okay, so in case of plant cells, when we place plant cells in isotonic solution, that is, where there is no net movement of water, the cells become flaccid. When the plant cells are placed in hypertonic solution, they become plasmolysed, that is, the cells shrink, and when the cells are placed in hypotonic solution, the cells swell up. Okay, that is, they become turgid. Okay. So this was about the three types of solutions in relation to the water potential. Okay. So this was about the osmosis. Now let's understand what is diffusion. Okay. So what is diffusion? What happens? Certain substances like carbon dioxide and oxygen, they show a spontaneous movement from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, and this process is known as diffusion. Thus, how can we define diffusion now? So it is a random or a spontaneous movement. Okay, so it is a small spontaneous movement of what? Of substances from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration. Okay, to a region of lower concentration. So this is how we can define the process of diffusion. Okay, so diffusion actually plays a very important role in the gaseous exchange between the cells as well as its environment. So when the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher inside the cell than its external environment, what happens? The carbon dioxide will move out of the cell by diffusion. While on the other hand, when oxygen enters the cell by diffusion, that means the concentration inside the cell is less. That is, the concentration of oxygen inside the cell is less compared to the external environment, and at that time oxygen enters inside the cell by diffusion. So it mainly helps in the exchange of gases between the cells as well as its environment. Okay. Now there are different types of diffusion. So diffusion, if we talk about, then it is of two types. One is the simple diffusion. Simple diffusion. And the other one is facilitated diffusion. Okay, so first we will be discussing about simple diffusion. Simple diffusion. So here what happens, the transport across the membrane takes place without the help of any transport proteins. Here transport across the membrane, how does it occur? It takes place or occurs without the help of what? Transport proteins, without the help of transport proteins or any carriers. Okay, so this process is known as simple diffusion. So during this process, what happens is a small molecule in aqueous solution dissolves into the phospholipid bilayer. Then it crosses it and dissolves into the aqueous solution on the opposite side. And the rate of diffusion, so the rate of diffusion will always be or will be proportional. So in this case, the rate of diffusion will be proportional to the concentration gradient across the membrane. Okay, so this is what is simple diffusion. Now let's talk about the facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion, or it is also known as co-transport diffusion. Okay, so facilitated diffusion or co-transport diffusion are one and the same. So it is a special type of passive transport. What is this? This is a special type of passive transport. Okay, in which, so in this mechanism what happens, in which the ions or the ions or molecules cross the membrane, they cross the membrane rapidly, and this happens through specific transmembrane, okay, this happens to specific transmembrane integral proteins. Okay, so this process is known as facilitated diffusion or co-transport diffusion. So in this transport mechanism, okay, so this transport mechanism does not require the metabolic energy. The rate of transport of the molecule across the membrane is greater than simple diffusion. Okay, so in this case the rate of transport of molecule will be higher than that is observed in case of simple diffusion. So each facilitated diffusion protein transports only a single species of ion or molecule. So maximum transport takes place at lower concentration gradient of molecule across the membrane. But sometimes the transport proteins form channels through the membrane to allow certain ions or molecules to pass through them. Okay, so according to this, the cell membrane possesses a number of channels for the passage of different ions. Okay, and the channels are kept closed by specific constituents called gates. Okay, so in some cases these channels are formed and the channels are kept closed by specific constituents or gates. So this is what we call as, this is called as facilitated diffusion. Okay, here the rate of transport of molecules across the membrane will be greater than that is observed in case of simple diffusion. Okay, and we can say that each facilitated diffusion protein, each of the facilitated diffusion protein, what does it do? It transports only a single species, of ion or a single species of molecule, and the maximum transport takes place at lower concentration gradient of molecule across the membrane. Okay, so now let's quickly revise everything that we have studied today. So today we have talked about the transport mechanism of molecules across the plasma membrane that takes place only by passive transport. So today we have only discussed passive transport. There are other mechanisms of transport that will be discussed in our next videos. Okay, so the movement across the plasma membrane mainly takes place by two mechanisms. One is passive transport and the other is active transport. Apart from these two, there are other mechanisms of transport like bulk transport, symport, antiport and uniport transport. Okay, today we will only be focusing about the passive transport mechanism, which takes place by osmosis, diffusion or facilitated transport. This facilitated transport is also a type of diffusion. Okay, so then we saw at first how to define passive transport. So passive transport is actually a process, and this is a process of movement of substances that takes place from one part of the system to another part without the expenditure of any energy. So in passive transport, no energy expenditure is required. Okay. Now passive transport can be divided, or passive transport actually takes place through two different mechanisms. One is osmosis and the other one is diffusion. So at first we discussed about osmosis. So osmosis is actually a process in which the water molecules pass from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, and this passage of water molecules takes place through a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, then there were two other terms called endosmosis and exosmosis. So endosmosis is a process where water molecules enter into the cell, whereas exosmosis is a process where water molecules exit from the cell. So in relation to water potential, there are three types of solution. One is isotonic solution. Here we have a diagram. Okay, so this is isotonic solution, then there is hypotonic solution, then there is hypertonic solution. So what happens in case of isotonic solution? So we have defined these three types of solutions. Isotonic solution, we call a solution isotonic when the intracellular and extracellular fluids have same concentration. What is hypertonic solution? A solution is called hypertonic when the extracellular fluids have a higher concentration of solutes than the intracellular fluids, and we call a solution hypotonic when the extracellular fluids have lower concentration of solutes than the intracellular fluids. So in such cases, so we discussed about these three types of solutions and what happens when we place cells in such solution. So when we place cells in isotonic solution, there is no net movement of water molecules, so there is no change that take place and the cells remain the same, and this is an example of plant cells that is shown in this diagram, and here the cells in case of isotonic solution, they become flaccid. Whereas when we place cells in hypertonic solution, what happens? Endosmosis takes place, that is the water molecules enter the cell, and as the water molecules enter the cell swell up. Okay, so in case of plant cells, they become turgid, and when the cells are placed in hypertonic solution, what happens? Exosmosis takes place, that is the water molecules move out of the cell. So in such cases, what happens? The cells actually shrink, and in plant cells the cells shrink and we call it a plasmolysed cells. Okay, so these were the three different types of solutions, and what happens when we keep the cells in such solutions we have discussed. Then we discussed about the process of diffusion. Okay, so what is diffusion now? Diffusion, we can define it as a spontaneous movement, and this spontaneous movement is of substances that takes place from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Okay, so diffusion again takes place, or diffusion can be further divided into two types. One is simple diffusion and the other is facilitated diffusion. Okay, so this diffusion, it actually plays an important role in the gaseous exchange between the cells as well as its environment. So when the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher inside the cell than its external environment, what happens? The carbon dioxide will move out of the cell by diffusion. Now on the other hand, the oxygen enters the cell by diffusion when its concentration inside the cell is less compared to that of external environment. Okay, now let's see what's simple diffusion. So simple diffusion, what happens here? Transport occurs. Here the transport takes place across the membrane, okay, without the help of any transport proteins or carrier proteins. So what happens is, during this process, a small molecule in aqueous solution dissolves into the phospholipid bilayer. Then it crosses it and dissolves into the aqueous solution on the opposite side. And the rate of diffusion will be proportional to the concentration gradient across the membrane. So this is about the simple diffusion. Here we have seen a diagram of diffusion, that is, we can see there is a semi-permeable membrane, and on one side the concentration is higher, whereas on the other side the concentration is lower. Now after a certain period of time, when this container is kept as it is, then what happens to the semi-permeable membrane? The molecules, okay, so here what happens? Here there is random or spontaneous movement of substances that is taking place from higher concentration to lower concentration. So after a period of time, we can see the molecules or substances have moved from the higher concentration to a region of lower concentration until it has reached an equilibrium. Okay, and this movement is taking place through a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, so we discussed about simple diffusion. Now let's see what is facilitated diffusion. This facilitated diffusion is also known as the co-transport diffusion. So this is a special type of passive transport in which the ions or molecules cross the membrane rapidly through a specific transmembrane integral proteins. Okay, so this transport mechanism does not require the metabolic energy, and the rate of transport of molecules across the membrane is greater than the simple diffusion, and each facilitated diffusion protein transports only one, that is only a single species of ion or molecule. Okay, so sometimes the transport, what happens, the maximum transport takes place at lower concentration gradient of molecule across the membrane. Now sometimes the transport proteins form channels through the membrane to allow certain ions or molecules to pass through them. So the cell membrane possesses a number of channels for the passage of different ions, and the channels are kept closed by specific constituents called the gates. Okay, so this is all about the facilitated diffusion or the co-transport diffusion. So I hope you all would have got some great insights by watching today's video. Please do not forget to like and share the video. Till then, thank you for watching.